Mary, could you provide some context on China's current COVID-19 vaccine coverage? What are the key vulnerabilities in the current coverage, and what are their implications?
So, China was among the first nations in the world to start testing and trialing a domestic vaccine against COVID-19 with approval in summer 2020 and starting rollout over the winter of 2020, 2021. And the result has been a pretty high rate of vaccination against COVID-19, as reported in news media. The question is, though, what exactly does it mean to talk about vaccination rates? Often, these are broken down into number of doses given. So, for example, the number that's currently floating around is about 3.5 billion doses given in China against COVID-19. And if you're estimating 2 doses per person being vaccinated, that's 122% of the population. If you account for boosters, however, then things start to look a little bit fuzzier. That said, vaccination rates are estimated to be pretty high. Some figures are being thrown out that suggest that as much as 90% of the population is fully vaccinated. That sounds great, but there are two key issues with whatever figure you're choosing to run with, namely the distribution of those doses by age, and then the particular kind of vaccine that's used. So, first, the distribution of doses gives a hint of a possible key vulnerability in vaccine coverage. There are different ways to think about distribution of vaccinations. Geographically, they've mostly gone to the bigger cities, as you might expect. But the bigger issue is age. So, as of last month, the estimates that I saw were that only about 60% of people age 60 and above, so that's 100 million people, have received a booster shot, which is great. But there are actually less than 20% of those aged 80 and above who are thought to have gotten a booster. It's pretty well established by now that the older you are, the more vulnerable you are to the worst symptoms and complications of COVID-19. So the implication of all of that is that the most vulnerable population in China, COVID-wise, is also possibly the least protected against infection. So, for instance, if people in China wanted to move away from the current zero COVID policy, that would be possibly risky for the lives of the oldest citizens. And the experience of Hong Kong here may be particularly instructive. In the spring, Hong Kong had one of the highest daily death rates from the virus for a while. And most of the people who died were unvaccinated older people. So I think around 65% of over 80s in Hong Kong hadn't been jabbed when the Omicron wave got underway. And so that provides a pretty forceful cautionary tale. So that's distribution of vaccines by age and some of the issues that that throws up. The second issue is the nature of the
Well,
vaccines.
let's do one at a time. So, like the classic, like I don't know anything about China. I'm very confused. Twitter take is like I thought this government was all powerful. Why can't they find all the 80-year-olds and put something in their arms? What are the sort of what are some of the dynamics stopping that from that stopped that from happening over the past few years?
Yeah, so I think it's less a question of state capacity and more one of state prioritization. But there is also an important question, I think, of persuasion versus coercion in getting people vaccinated. So, first, prioritization. In general, with the domestic vaccine rollouts in China that we saw, the people who were prioritized to get vaccines first were pretty sensibly the people who were younger and going around in society more. So, to give some anecdotal examples, the friends I have who are university professors were getting vaccinated earlier than I was here in the UK. And that was understood to be in part because they were expected to be teaching, hopefully going back to classrooms as soon as possible. And so there was a logic that those who are involved in key occupations, occupations that involve a lot of social contact, those should be the ones to get vaccines earlier than others. So that's one issue around prioritization. But there is also a serious question, I think, around vaccine hesitancy, one might call it, or resistance to getting a vaccine, or indifference to getting vaccines. And this is something that's also been reported on, the idea that older people are a bit more reluctant, perhaps, to go and line up and get a vaccine. They offer a variety of reasons, um, ranging from, as I say, indifference, that I've gotten this far and it's not really necessary, to hesitance. that it's possibly unsafe to get a COVID vaccine. And there are lots of reasons that we could drill down into for that kind of hesitancy. But I think that's an overview of some of the reasons why older people have been vaccinated so far at lower rates.
Sure. Let's talk about vaccine hesitancy. What is it? What's lurking underneath that?
There are a couple of reasons for contemporary hesitancy around the COVID-19 vaccination in China. And some of those reasons have to do with age, but some of those, I think, have to do with much broader kind of attitudes and approaches. But basically, there are historical reasons why we might, and when I say historical, I mean recent historical reasons as to why we might see vaccine hesitancy in broad swaths of the Chinese population today. There are also COVID-specific reasons for hesitancy around vaccines. So the recent past has not exactly made a lot of people really confident in Chinese vaccine distribution networks. And I'm thinking here of a particular issue in 2018 around Changshan Biotech. I don't know if this is ringing any bells, but as part of a series, I think, of news stories, scandals that occurred over the early 21st century, one of the things that kind of got caught up in questions and concerns about safety of food and drugs in China was that of vaccines. So the case of Changshan is illuminative here. In July 2018, this firm was found to have fabricated production and inspection records for its rabies vaccines. It was further found to have given ineffective vaccines to children in China. So this was a company that was basically not looking after the cold chain that allows vaccines to maintain their efficacy. And as a result, it was basically giving expired vaccines or ineffective vaccines to kids. And it doesn't seem necessarily that it caused a huge number of mortalities. It meant, though, that the vaccines that were being given were not considered to be valid. And so this sparked an investigation into vaccine producers nationwide. 15 people were detained, 6 officials were sacked. But I think one of the upshots of that, particularly because of the widespread media coverage, was the message that the vaccines that you trust to be given to your kids aren't necessarily always going to be protected and delivered in a way that is the safest. So that was kind of an issue, I think, that caused a lot of concern and hesitancy down the roads.